Our next speaker is the host of the Week That Really Was podcast, Sarah Ryan.
Thank you. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Ryan. I'm a barrister and I'm the co-host of The Week That Really Was with John McGurk. I'm a mother of 3 children and I'm 41, and back before the main social pariah in Ireland was being a white male, I was a dynastic Fianna Fáil politician, and trust me, back in the day in around 2008, it was literally the worst social thing you could be. So I've been immersed in politics my whole life. My father was a Fianna Fáil TD, he was a minister, he was an MEP, and I was immersed in that my whole childhood and my whole adult life. And one thing I always say to people about that is that my father was, and still is, a true liberal, in the sense that, you know, we had lots of debates in our house, but my parents were really open to having different views from them. And even though they were extremely liberal, they ended up having 2 quite conservative, 2 out of 3 quite conservative children. And they were comfortable with the fact that as long as we were able to hold our own and have our opinions, that's, you roll the dice. And if you don't indoctrinate your kids and you bring them up to have minds of their own, you have to accept that that might be what happens. And I'm fully prepared that that might mean that I end up, you know, one of my kids being the next Richard Boyd Barrett, but listen, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But, you know, in saying all that, I suppose I'm a lifetime of being surrounded by politics, and I took a long time out and I had my kids, and in the last couple of years with the podcast, and then last year I ran Niall Boylan's campaign for Europe, I've put my head above the parapet a bit again, and I suppose the main reason why I've done that is because even though I'm politically homeless and I don't really know, even though I was in Fianna Fáil and I'm not in a political party now and I don't really know where I would fit in, I am really passionate about the discourse in Ireland and the quality of the conversations we have. And it's not, you know, it's not, obviously the aim of the game is to win elections and get people elected, but it is also really important to have hard conversations about hard topics and to develop as a society to be mature enough to have conversations about immigration without calling people racist, about transgenderism without calling people transphobes, etc., etc. So I've tried with the podcast to, you know, with John, we try and have hard conversations about things and say things, and we do get like a bit of negative feedback, but to be honest, like when it started, I thought my whole life was going to be about kind of online abuse, and really it's quite the opposite, because I think there's a lot of people just like me who are homeless, who don't know where to go, and who feel that the conversation or the discourse that we're having in Ireland is really just less than we deserve. And you know, there's a lot of, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but like there's just so much cowardice. We don't have politicians who are, I'm fine with a politician not representing what I think on every issue, but I have a bare minimum expectation that somebody will have the courage to say what they really think. And for a long time before the podcast started, I'm friends with a lot of politicians, and not just, you know, from being in Fianna Fáil, but Labour politicians, some Sinn Féin even, certainly some Fine Gaelers. I'm a barrister, the bar is full of Fine Gaelers, unfortunately. And, you know, they would say, oh, well, I really agree with what you're saying, but sure, you can't say that. Well, you can, actually, you can. And I appreciate, like my dad was a TD, I appreciate you worked really hard to become a politician, pays your mortgage, you've got kids. I get all that. I get it's hard. And maybe you got into politics because you want to represent people on X, Y, and Z issue, and you don't want to stick your head above the parapet on A, B, and C. But at the same time, I think we deserve people who will represent things. You know, immigration is not a niche issue. This comedian recently, Garen, I can't remember his surname, but like that wasn't a weird thing that he said. That's what most people think. And the thing is that the truth is that, yes, we weren't sold a great alternative in the last general election, but there's a lot of people out there who don't agree with a lot of the topics that are coming out, that the way things are talked about, and who are disappointed in the political cowardice that we see and the media cowardice that we see day to day from people who pretend to think one way because it's easier and who really think what we think. And, you know, the idea behind Grip Media and the idea behind podcasts was to give a space for people to listen to something that was a little bit more like what some of you think. And it's growing and going from strength to strength for that exact reason. So that being said, tonight is about whether or not Ireland is at breaking points, and I'm going to talk about a couple of issues that are particularly, that I'm particularly passionate about, and but that aren't particularly kind of in your face or day to day obvious. In my work, I work in the CCJ in criminal law, and often you have these very tough conversations with people about how, you know, they're completely fixated on a trial and got to go to trial, and you have to kind of say, like, look, you have to kind of see the wood from the trees here. You're probably going to go to jail, so you should probably make a plea or whatever. But I sometimes tell them this kind of joke that is, it's not well a joke, but it's two fish are swimming along, and they're approached by another fish, and as the fish comes towards them, he says, "Hi guys, water's lovely today." And the two fish keep on swimming, and then one of them turns to the other a couple of minutes later and goes, "What the fuck is water?" And I think that we're surrounded by issues that are bringing Ireland to breaking point that we don't even see. And the first one that I'm very passionate about, because I have two sons, is the just complete obsession with overly pathologising men. You mentioned about this adolescent TV show. It's so much worse and so much deeper than that, and it's all the time. And all we hear about is, oh, you know, I saw a Fine Gael politician coming out last week talking about how we have to work on, you know, toxic men or whatever. I'm 41. I grew up in Ireland. I've mostly known nice men. I've never been abused by any man or whatever, and I resent very deeply the idea that I have to train the abuse or the toxicity out of my boys who are 6 and 8. My brother's not like that, my father's not like that, and we are just constantly inundated with this messaging that the worst thing you can possibly be is male, and that everything to do, and we see it now, and I'll get to it about RTE up front the other day, but constantly dismantling every single aspect of masculinity and being a man, and ridiculing it and making it a bad thing. What's wrong with being masculine? What's wrong? On RTE the other day, my colleague Ben Scanlon was debating, and the guy who was on with him actually said, "I don't want to be a protector of women." I mean, like, sorry, but I'm a woman, and I've been economically and physically vulnerable by pregnancy. I'd like to be married to somebody who feels like protecting me. I don't want to be the one with the baseball bat at the top of the stairs if somebody comes into the house. Thanks. I mean, if needs be, I'm 5'10", I'll give it a go. But, you know, this idea that there's something wrong, like, toxic masculinity has been, in their interpretation of it, has been at the root of loads of positive things. I'm sure there was some toxic masculinity involved when we entered into the GPO in 1916. I'm sure there's toxic masculinity involved in loads of progressive things that have happened over the years. And we never talk about toxic femininity or feminism. I think it's pretty toxic that we have a girl who's having sex with 1,000 men in a 24-hour period online, and that nobody talks about the damage she's doing to women or girls. It's just that she's somehow a victim. We make her the victim. We don't talk about how that's toxic. We don't talk about how men are, you know, why they're going towards people like Andrew Tate. It's not about Andrew Tate's a great guy. It's about that if you systematically dismantle every single aspect of being a boy, that's where they find their heroes, because they don't know anything else. You've made it the worst thing they can possibly be. They don't know where to go. They're told all the time they need to be trained, they need to be unmasculine, they need to be this, they need to be that. No wonder their minds are scrambled. And then we have this, I would say, propaganda in TV shows like Adolescence, which reinforces this thing, oh, they're incels, they're going on the internet, we need to help them, we need to stop them. Maybe we need to stop telling them there's something wrong with them all the time and start being kinder to boys and raising our boys to be, in the same ways we do girls, to be people in society, to protect people, to be kind, whatever. But not telling them that there's something intrinsically wrong with them from the out. It's just, no, I mean, again, like, I'm not a fan of Conor McGregor. I don't really care, but I completely understand why somebody, a young male, would feel like that was more representative of them than the guy who goes on to RTE up front and says, I don't want to be responsible for protecting women. I just want to live in a society where, you know, women can protect themselves and maybe someday protect me. I mean, talk about the ick heard around the world. Like, if you actually watch that, and I'd encourage you to watch it, you see the camera pans to the audience, and there's 3 girls in the audience, and you can see the 3 of them just go, ugh. Like, you know, I mean, again, horses for courses, whatever he wants, but making being a man and being a young man a bad thing. You know, when I was growing up, parents tended to be more worried about their daughters than their sons. I feel now more worried about my sons than my daughter, in a world that tells them that everything is wrong with them, they'll never do anything right, that they're privileged, but that they'll get, you know, that someone will always pass them out, someone will always deserve it more than them, and that everything is stacked against them from the start. And meanwhile, they're inundated with bikinis and Lily Phillips and having sex, whatever. But don't victimize women. Don't, you know, the messaging is just completely wrong. I think it's really damaging for society. I think it's going to have long-term consequences. And when we talk about whether or not Ireland is at breaking point, I think that's the place that we should put our attention and that we should focus on to protect this generation and future generations of boys from feeling like they have nothing worthwhile to offer us as a society, because I think that they do. The next thing I want to talk about is, I suppose, I'm going to call it the NGO or bloated NGO sector. I'm originally a history student, and I was really interested and used to read a lot about the thinkers in the Frankfurt School and aligned activists or philosophers like Gramsci, and they would talk about dismantling societies and to be deliberately more left-wing, the so-called progressive society, anti-family, anti-individual, anti-capitalist realities. And they did this by recognising basically that they could tackle the reality by what sets the reality, and that wasn't politics, that was institutions. And our politicians would have you think that they're what's driving the agenda, but really the agenda in Ireland is driven by institutions, by people who aren't voted for, by people who got into jobs. The institutions of the state. Basically, Gramsci called this plan the march through the institutions, which is that you change society by these unseen, unheard, invisible institutions. And that is happening every day. That's the water in my story around you. Every day there are people who are paid to drive an agenda, to set the tone. They're paid our taxpayer money. They're not answerable, and they set the tone for everything. So they went into college. It started with the colleges. They basically arts, media, education, politics. The students from those courses became NGO executives, school teachers, journalists, and sometimes politicians. And they began to change norms in all those fields, so that teachers became more activists than educators. Not all teachers. I come from a family of teachers, so I would never say all teachers, but a lot of teachers. Journalists are now more activists that are more activists and propagandists than actual fact checkers. Politicians are paymasters for NGOs. This all happens every day, and that's why politicians will never stand up against NGOs. Tens of thousands of NGOs we have. A lot of them, Gript did a really interesting piece of research last year where we found that the only NGO that had been defunded by the government was the NGO that was set up to oversee NGO spending and NGO roles. So completely absurd, no accountability. And in every debate, there'll be somebody from the government will say, oh, so you're just saying dismantle the GAA. Yeah, sure. We're not talking about the GAA, we're talking about small NGOs that are getting a lot of taxpayers' money to actually pump nonsense, unargued, unchecked nonsense into schools, into school books, into the media. And they are propped up by the government, they're propped up by TDs, and nobody ever challenges them. And it's a massive cancer, in my opinion, in our society. And if Ireland is at breaking point, I think the NGO sector is going to be the thing that will tip us over. And then the final thing area that I think I would call it overall, is political and media cowardice. Like I said earlier on, you see a huge amount of journalists going into political advisory. There's no courage in terms of calling people to account. Journalists, are supposed to be a watchdog, and in actual fact, they've turned out to be a lapdog for the government. They don't challenge anything. They set the terms, and this is where Gript Media originally came from. Gript Media came from the idea that there was no voice for an alternative view, and that's still the case. And Gript is growing, and it's great that Ben will often be on TV3 on late night shows, and there is a little bit of acceptance of maybe that might be worth having people from Gript. But the truth is that there's still a huge snobbery. We will be blocked out at every turn. We will be ignored. We're fringe. We're right. We're racist. We're this or that. But the truth is that I would say, from people who approach me in the street, that Gript is representative of a huge amount of people in Ireland and what they think. Gript is a place that people go to feel like they're not completely alone. The amount of politicians who, like I said before, will say to me, oh, I agree with you, but they say to me as well, oh, I listen to the podcast every week. One said to me in particular, when Niall Boylan ran for election, we were in the count, a very senior minister in Fianna Fáil said to me, he said, I listen to your podcast. I shouldn't say this, but I listen to your podcast every week. And he said, I'm so jealous. And I said, what are you jealous of? And he said, because you're free. And I thought, isn't that the most depressing thing you've ever heard? I mean, sad, but true. He thinks what I think, and he thinks I'm free because I get to say it. And he goes into government he is a minister in this government, and he doesn't feel like he can say what he really thinks. I mean, if Ireland isn't at breaking point, if our political classes feel so shackled to an agenda that's driven by other people who aren't electable, who aren't accountable, or elected, or are accountable, I mean, what hope is there for the rest of us? We have to, figure out a way to have these hard conversations, to challenge this kind of stuff, because, I appreciate that politicians have jobs and they have mortgages to pay or whatever, but like this what's right is right, and the level of cowardice that exists amongst the political classes and journalists as well, who'll do the exact same, is frightening. And what I will say from a positive point of view is in the last few months, I have started to notice some green shoots in terms of a little bit of bravery from people within news talk. I noticed Ciara Kelly coming out a couple of times, and I was quite pleasantly surprised. Now, I'm talking about really minimal effort. But, something like people starting to be a little bit more brave, maybe about being honest about what are the problems, speaking honestly about immigration, speaking honestly about things. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think we have to be more decent and more kind and more honest about that. There's nothing wrong with young men in Ireland, save for some very small exceptions. The level of exceptions also exists in women. So we have to start being more honest about and challenge the spend that's going on NGOs. We have to be, or another thing I was going to say about men is that, anyone who listens to the podcast will say, and I was reluctant to talk about it tonight because I just hammer this drum every single week on the podcast, so anyone who listens is probably bored. But we have to move beyond a situation where the only man that's worth anybody's attention or time in Ireland is the man who puts a dress on and calls himself Mary. Because I'm just really tired of this kind of trans agenda being pushed down our throats all the time. I object in the strongest terms to a man being in the changing room with me and my daughter. I object in the strongest terms to a man being in a swimming or an athletic situation whatsoever with any of my children. I object to men being put into women's prison with women who are vulnerable and who are, in very difficult situations. I object in the strongest of terms to all of it, and it's a hill I'm happy to die on. But it's a niche area, and I know that, so I'm just getting it out there. But I just wanted to say as well that, even though Ireland is at breaking point, there is a lot of good and there's a lot of positive stuff about being in Ireland. And Ireland might not be a great place to live in all the time, but it is a great place to be from. And I love, being from Ireland, and I love all the madness of us, and I love that we, develop unhealthy obsessions with people like Mattress Mick, and I love that the way the Eskimos have 100 words for snow, but we have one word. We say a woman suffers with her nerves, which covers absolutely everything from a slightly nervous disposition to a full-on paranoid schizophrenic, and nothing in between. I love that we are obsessed with where people are from and how we know them, and that we know their uncle and their auntie and all that. It's a great place to be from. But we have to be more mature about having hard conversations. We have to get real about challenging our politicians and our discourse to be honest, to grasp the nettle, to be brave when it comes to talking about things that your neighbour might not like, but like at the end of the day, it's what's right is right. And the first place, I suppose, to start is to have conversations and nights like this, and to attend things and to push back and to show that you're interested in an alternative view. And you all did that by being here. So thank you very much.